Christ is the center of our home, a guest at every meal, a silent listener to every conversation. God is number one. America first. America. 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 I have fought racism my entire life, from a young man on, when I first entertained the thought of racism was when I saw the Ku Klux Klan group at Sanfordtown when I was about 14 years old. I went home and talked to my mother about it, and I saw how wrong it was. And I've been fighting racism ever since, and I can tell you to this day, America is no racist nation. And this business of cheap preaching and teaching, 1619 is where we began, is wrong. It's incorrect. It's a bold-faced lie. America is no racist nation. We were founded in 1776, and we are a nation that loves everyone. I remember teaching the very first Black History course in a public school in the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 1970 at Erlanger Lloyd High School. And before that, my student teaching at Jessamine County High School, and taking the first two courses offered at the University of Kentucky in 1968 and 69 by Dr. Stephen Channing, and rallying and marching with Dr. Martin Luther King and passing the Civil Rights Bill in Kentucky, marching to the Federal Building in Cincinnati as president of the student body at Northern Kentucky University, what today is and was University of Kentucky Extension Center Community College. And yes, nominating the first black person, Reverend Mack, to serve on the Democratic Executive Committee from Boone County. And yes, helping to start the first political action arm for school teachers called Kentuckians for Better Schools with Bert T. Combs and David Shear and Preston Young. And being a worker with Gil Hammond as the UNISERV director with the Kentucky Education Association, and myself as president of the Education Association at Erlanger Lloyd and the Ellesmere school systems. And voting one time for Jesse Jackson in a primary, and voting for the first election of President Obama and Joe Biden. A terrible mistake I made. And since then, I've been disappointed in the Democratic Party, and therefore I suggest that people vote Republican for honesty and truth and godly principles.
1619 Project. I've read this book, and I recommend it to you very, very strongly. Professor, welcome, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Now, you seem very concerned about this 1619 Project, so let's walk through this if we can. What is it that occurred in 1619 that the New York Times and the author of the project claim was actually the founding moment of the United States?
An English pirate ship brought 20-some, we don't know the exact number, of enslaved Africans to Jamestown, Virginia. That ship had intercepted a Spanish slave ship in the Caribbean, taken most of the slaves and sold them in Bermuda, and brought the remainder up to Jamestown, where they traded them for provisions. According to the New York Times, that event was the beginning of slavery in what was going to become America. There's some problems with that, which I can go into, but basically the New York Times' claim was that that event is the real beginning of America, that the nation that was going to be was founded on the oppression of African slaves, the white supremacy that emerged from that, and the centuries that followed in which this attempt to extract labor and to oppress the rights of black people became the founding idea of who we are, what we are, and everything else that followed. It's a matter of some interest to me as a scholar that the event as described didn't really take place. What had happened was that Jamestown, Virginia did not recognize slavery, so it took these captives and treated them as indentured servants. It's not maybe the best place to be in your life at the prime of life, but an indentured servant only serves a few years of servitude and then is set free. And we know historically that that's exactly what happened to these captives. They were set free. They were not reduced to a lifetime of slavery. If you want to call their position of indentured servitude slavery, it was certainly of a very mild form and nothing like the slavery that we normally think of when we're thinking of the chattel slavery of the pre-Civil War South. In any case, slavery had already been in North America and South America millennia before the arrival of this pirate ship, and that was partly because Native Americans, as we know from both South America and North America, were themselves engaged in enslaving each other and later on whites when they could capture them. Slavery was, of course, something that was nearly universal in the human experience. All around the world, cultures, societies held people as captives and enslaved them. So it wasn't an invention of the people in Jamestown in 1619. It wasn't an invention of the English colonists in the New World. The Spanish and the Portuguese had been enslaving both Native Americans and African captives well before this. Slavery in what was going to become the United States had already been there for at least 100 years because the Spanish had brought slaves to what is now Florida and to Georgia. So things are a bit more complicated than the Times made out, but their founding idea is that the United States became the inheritor of this original sin of slavery, and that became the basis of all our sort of focal institutions, our economy, our laws, our very principles of freedom and equality were, according to this reinterpretation of American history, simply a smokescreen in order to make people feel justified in violating the natural rights of other people. So that's where I took off in writing a book about this.
It seems awfully strange that the New York Times and their project would pick 1619 as opposed to some other date, isn't it? And this is being now pushed into our school systems. I understand 3,500 school systems are now using this. The New York Times is intentionally preparing educational materials for this. So the argument would go that 1776 not only wasn't the real event, the Declaration of Independence, and really prior to 1776, 1760s, 1770s, 1775, when the Revolutionary War really started, but that the Revolutionary War wasn't really for independence, they argue. It was to enshrine slavery. We'll be right back.
This is one thing I really resent, is the fact that they are using this in our schools. And as a former government teacher, advanced government teacher, and history teacher, spending my life studying history and teaching the Black history courses and both the television shows that I've done, almost 1,000 of them on public access, many of them about Black history and the history of our nation, and traveling throughout the world in my Europe a Train series, and throughout the United States and Canada and Mexico, and studying the histories of these areas. I think it's a tragedy that the New York Times is now spending their money trying to tell lies about our history and fomenting this idea that we are racist in America, which is totally untrue. And I'm probably the best example of that. because of my background and former superintendent of education for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the last elected one, and myself supporting openly and publicly, as anyone can attest in Northern Kentucky, campaigned heavily for President Barack Obama and Joe Biden's election. And unfortunately, they did not tell the truth in their campaigns and were seriously harmful to our country in many ways. And I think that we've gone from what they were wanting to characterize as racism in the nations and as racism in the political party, the Democratic political party, but trying to stir up anger and hurt amongst people, leading them to riots and murders and looting in our cities. Those same cities run by mayors, who many of them refuse to support their police departments. I totally support the police and law and order, and so do the black people that I know. Having served as an officer myself as commissioner of motor vehicles for the state of Kentucky many years ago, as an officer myself, and having all of the weight motor vehicle enforcement officers under my command, there never was ever a racist thought in my mind. And I think that it's a tragedy to see the media pushing this sort of thing just to get votes for their Marxist desires. And unfortunately, the oligarchists, the huge corporations of high technology, the major ones, including Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and AT&T and monopolies, and their banning of the President Donald Trump from using Facebook and Twitter shamefully to affect their campaign in a derogatory way. Shameful. And I listened to this gentleman who's a great historian talk about the difference between 1619 and 1776.
Welcome back, Professor Peter Wood, President of the National Association of Scholars, author of an excellent book, 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project. So my question to you, Professor, is this. Was the purpose of the revolution in 1776 to enshrine slavery? Because if it was, after all these decades of studying the American Revolution, I must have missed it. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond to it as something that was just made up pretty much out of thin air. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead writer for the 1619 Project, contributed the first substantial essay to the 100-page magazine supplement where the Times launched it. And in it, she made a number of claims that I think just have to be seen as preposterous. One of them is the idea that the American Revolution was fought by the colonists against England because they feared that the English king was going to emancipate American slaves and end the institution of slavery. Now, there just is nothing behind that. We know why the American Revolution was fought. If nothing else, we have this handy document called the Declaration of Independence, in which Thomas Jefferson laid out about 20-some reasons why the colonists should rebel. It didn't occur to him that they should rebel because